It is my great honor and pleasure to welcome you warmly on behalf of Organizational Board of the Conference, Representation of the Holocaust in the Balkans in Arts and Media. As the most frequent determination in international use, Holocaust as a term figures systematic exodus and genocide over Jewish people. However, general term is identified with exodus and genocide over Romani people and Slavs, homosexuals, and political opponents against occupying regimes, i.e. over identities of differences or otherness. Although proven with numerous legislation processes, its denial, revitalization, systematic oblivion, and speculation with the numbers of victims in the public discourse presents danger for the present moment and the future as well. Anticipating total numbers of the victims of Holocaust in the Balkans during the World War II, relatively small numbers of media, even the artistic texts on the issue, cannot be overlooked, especially if we take into consideration data on suffering and ostracism of Jewish people on the territory of ex-Yugoslavia, Romani people in Romania, but also Slav people in concentration camps such as Jasenovac, Staro Sajmište, Banjica, or Jajinci. Nevertheless, this topic obtrudes as socially important and demands the new insight. The aim of this conference, Representation of the Holocaust in the Balkans in Arts and Media Hands, is an attempt of mapping and corpus of these texts, systematization, as well as recognition of its function in constructing multi-direct memories of the Balkans past. Not less important is creation of the insight on the role of protecting the institution of the memory in modern Balkan states by providing the support to production of modern but preserving and systematization of the existing media and artistic texts on the Holocaust at the Balkans. Nourishing and affirmation of culture of the memory, right via media texts, presents important step for keeping up the tolerance and stability in the region. A year ago, Diskurs, NGO, started to prepare for this scientific conference. Ever since, Diskurs, as a young, unexperienced organization, whose members, my colleagues and friends, great individuals, managed to acquire great support from major institutions and agencies. Without financial support of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance and Ministry of Culture and Information, we would not be for certain able to host all of you and organize this assembly with more than 35 participants from the region and Europe. I would seize this opportunity and thank for the partnership and cooperation to the Faculty of Dramatic Arts in Belgrade, Center for Culture and Cultural Studies from Skopje, Belgrade Youth Center, Dom Omladine, and especially to Shoah Memorial from Paris, for putting this conference with such important topic to deserve position on the social and cultural map of Serbia and the region. I will also like to thank all the members of Jewish community for being with us today. It is with our hope that this conference shall manage to offer new views, new topics, develop discussion, and bring to new knowledge and insight into our joint past. Securing Holocaust will never happen again and not to be forgotten at the same time. Now, I would like to invite Mr. Bruno, responsible for international relations at the Memorial of Shoah, to officially open this conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I understand I have 2 hours for my speech.
2.5.
2.5, that's correct. So go ahead. As head of international relations for the Shoah Memorial, it's a great honor for me to be in Belgrade on the occasion of this symposium on the representations of the Holocaust in the Balkans. I would like to thank the NGO Diskurs for their kind invitations. I know how deeply and consistently this institution has been working to educate and inform people, to fight anti-Semitism, and to promote intercultural dialogue. My gratitude extends to Nevena Daković and to Boban Jeftic for their willingness to include the memorial in this remarkable event. The institution that I represent was founded in 1943 and is entirely devoted to the remembrance of the victims and to education. Our policy is mainly focused on a scientific and historical approach, an understanding of the Holocaust as a political fact, an approach that it means to be a careful study of the process and a relevant analysis of the criminal ideology. At a recent symposium held within our walls and dealing with the Holocaust in Greece, a museum director was considering that the only way to transmit the memory was to shock the audience, or pupils, whoever, to catch them unaware, to provoke a trauma. In other words, to put them in a highly emotional state. I have a totally opposite position on Holocaust education. We have to focus on a political level. Emotion is not a key to understand the Holocaust. That is the reason why the memorial rather favor scientific events or symposiums and education training focused on history. Therefore, you will understand that the involvement of the memorial in this symposium to which we are taking part with the presentation intervention of Paul Bernard was not self-evident. Yet, I wanted the memorial to be present for two reasons. First, I consider the Balkans as a very important issue for genocide and Holocaust educations. The memorial is now active in terms of teacher training, expert meetings, and public partnerships in most countries of the area, and very soon such will be the case with Serbia. I will not be so audacious to remind you, before such leading experts gathered here, the importance of the stake of Holocaust remembrance in the Balkans and their geopolitical consequences in the area. For a few years, the memorial has focused its action towards an overall reflection, including all the genocides and step by step the act of mass violence. The reports between the Shoah and the act of mass violence during the Second World War, as pointed out by Timothy Snyder for another region with a territory in the east called Bloodlands, has a very special resonance in the Balkans. It is another reason for the memorial to be present in this area. I will just quote two examples of our actions, a roundtable next November on the Holocaust educational policies, bringing together the representative of the Ministry of Education of Macedonia, Serbia, Croatia, Slovenia, and Bosnia and Herzegovina. And next May, Serbian, Bosnian, and Croatian teachers will be meeting in Jasenovac for a common training on history and remembrance. I must admit, this meeting will be the first of its kind for the last 20 years. And I wanted to take in your debates because we are in Belgrade. The Sajmište Memorial is at the heart of our concerns, and this issue has a very important place in your symposium. I am aware of the effort of the Jewish community of Belgrade, of some scientists who are here with us today, and of the authorities to achieve the erecting of a new complex that will lead to the full integration of the multiple memories of the place, the Jewish memories and the memories of the Serbs interned after 1942. The Shoah in Serbia called us because of the speed of its process, a few months for able-bodied men, less than a year for families. It called us because of its procedures, like a summary of the destruction implemented by the Nazis, carbon monoxide, starving, and shootings. Last, because of its geography, not in the heart of a capital, but in its immediate proximity, under one very eyes, which is a pretty unique example during the Holocaust. Therefore, the building of a new memorial is a necessity, both in terms of respect for the victims and of consideration of the importance of the specificity of the Holocaust in Serbia. I know all the difficulties linked to this kind of project, namely the relocations of some inhabitants and the fundings. I am the representative of an institution for which it took 60 years to be set up after 50 years of state responsibility denial. So I believe I can understand the difficulty you are facing here. Nevertheless, I'm thinking about these huge urban projects that will soon rise on the other side of the Sava, on the shore facing Sajmište, Beograd-na-Vodi. You will no doubt agree with me that it was a very fast decision. Serbia is a member of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. It is an applicant state to the European Union. It seemed obvious to me that Belgrade, on the eve of one of the last big commemorations to celebrate the liberation of two killing centers, Auschwitz and Jasenovac, should grant the new memorial of Sajmište its rightful place as soon as possible. It is time. all of us committed with Holocaust remembrance in Serbia and abroad are looking carefully how the project has been carried out. I'm firmly convinced that the new Commission will act in an appropriate way, that we could meet soon in Belgrade for the opening of this new European memorial. Thank you for your attention. I wish you a fruitful debate.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, friends, guests from abroad, it is my great pleasure and disadvantage to speak after Monsieur Bruno after such condensed and all-encompassing, all-involving speech. But first, before proceeding to the matter of my presentation, I would like to take this opportunity to ask you and to present to you all the people responsible for the organization of this wonderful event. And they are sitting somewhere in the darkness. Of course, this is the NGO Discourse Conference Organization headed by Ceric and his team, and the lovely lady fil rouge of this conference, of this whole event of the remembrance, Jagoda Stamenković, is specially responsible for this modern art part. And here I take a moment just to invite you and to recommend to you to see the exhibition going on in Dom Omladine. This is the exhibition of the drawings of Miloš Bajić, and one of his drawings is in fact the wonderful poster for this event. So Jagoda helped Vlada put together all facets of this event. Last but not the least, I would like to thank I would say physical host of this whole event, and much more than that, Dom Omladine, represented by Dušana Nikolić and of course Boban Jeftić. And now I would like to take the privilege, since I'm from the Faculty of Drama Arts, instead of thanking first Memorial de la Shoah de Paris and Monsieur Boyer, I would like to thank Faculty of Drama Arts, especially Institute for Theatre, Cinema, Radio and Television, and here present the director of the Institute, Professor Mirjana Nikolić-Đorđević. Of course, our dear guests and colleagues from Macedonia, from the Center for Culture and Cultural Studies, and, as I already said, our dear colleagues and friends from Paris who helped us organize the whole thing. And may I ask you to give them a public thank by clapping for all of them. And the official title of my paper is, in fact, double, or I would say triple. It's a revelation of Himmelkommando, or the impossible testimony. The first part of the title, in fact, is derived from the book that's been published just recently, and it's about film studies and the film essays and the essays on the film text of remembrance and memory. I'm going to be very personal. This is the book dedicated to my personal past, as well to the past of the art and media in the Balkans. It's dedicated to my grandfather and my mother, who recently passed away, but who had passed through many of the historical events depicted and analyzed through films in this book. One of the privileges when you return to one topic many times is that by each return to the topic you have more and more clear perspective. What would you like to say? And this is in fact described in the second part of the title, Impossible Out of Fiction. You can read it as a possible fiction, but it also could be the third title, and the third title is in fact Impossible Testimonies and the Possible Witnesses. And now this is the last of my digressions. I'm going to cut straight to the point. Praising Theodore Adorno, Serge Denis says that after Alain René Brouillard, there is no fiction about Holocaust. The idea of this paper is to challenge Serge Denis, among other things, and at the same time rehabilitate old ex-Yugoslav film with a number of titles: Himmelkommando, Nebeski Odres, Celestial Squad, The Sky Battalion, made by Boško Bošković and Ilija Nikolić after the famous classical theatre play written by Đorđe Lebović and Aleksandar Obrenović, to rescue it from oblivion with many other things. I would try to argue that it represents the very possible fiction of Shoah in the post-prohibition, post-1956 era. Made in 1961, this remarkable film cleverly moved the limits of representation of Shoah. Being no real fiction, even less than as rejected image of the post-aesthetic, it becomes probably or possibly much sought after permitted form or format. The semi or half documentary structures of rich metaphorical value respond respond to, within cinema, the modern obligation to pronounce the stop on the image and the embargo on fiction. The aim was to tell another story differently, where mankind was the only character and the first anti-star. The aim was to give birth to another cinema which would know that to give the event back to fiction too early is to remove its uniqueness, because fiction is that freedom which disperses and which opens itself in advance to the infinity of the variation and to the seduction of the true lies. In fact, the authors of this film cleverly rescued the story of Sonderkommando to fall into the fiction, moving it toward faction, possible testimony, and possible witnessing. The arguments for the exceptional status of Himmelkommando that marks the conceptual shift from prohibition and taboo to permission and responsibility could be paraphrased as following. The film conforms to the format of autobiography and perhaps autofiction that underlays the documentarism and authenticity of the depicted and lived-through experience. The witness survivor, that according to Primo Levi is not the true one, is transformed into the true witness narrator, that, resurrected, survived. And finally, the film stands as an example of the hybrid style of symbolism, expressionism, and realism that coalesced into the hyperrealism, and of the modernist form of the text and narrative that repeats the traumatic structure of the experience of witnessing. So, I'm sorry, I'm again dealing with trauma. I can't escape that. So, the film Himmelkommando is made after brilliant, nowadays classical drama of George Leibovich and Alexander Obrenović, before and above all recognized as the textual reenactment of Leibovich's personal traumatic experience in Auschwitz. The world of the survivors who levitate as shadows between life and death, terror and freedom, long physical recovery, and prolonged psychological trauma becomes the initial point of the drama, presented with the uncanny calm both of the witness and of the victim. The writer relives through the text the tragic chronicle and the thoughts of the living dead, of those who sentence themselves to suicide in the world between life and death, being dispossessed of everything but the instinct for survival. Slobodan Selenic sees the text as a demarcation line in the history of the modern Serbian drama, emphasizing its stylistic hybridity and autobiographical aspect. The text contains data of most certain authenticity, deeply lived through scenes filled through author's personal experience. Petar Marjanović argues the text to be the first Serbian realistic drama of the post-war period with strong philosophical sensibility. The main characters, as you can see on this blurred picture, but I think there is no decent copy of the film in whole of former Yugoslavia. The main characters are 7 members of Sonderkommando, and here I cannot resist but to quote famous Didier Huberman description of the members of Sonderkommando. Ils n'avaient pas figure humaine, c'était des visages ravagés, fous. On dit les détenus qui ont pu les voir. À une détenue qui lui demandait comment il pouvait supporter pareil travail, un membre de l'équipe répondit. Évidemment, je pourrais me jeter sur les fils électriques, comme tant de mes camarades, mais je veux vivre. De notre travail, si on ne devient pas fou le premier jour, on s'habitue. Façon de parler, certains se jetteraient simplement dans le feu qui croyaient pourtant être habitués. So these are the members of the special unit, the Jewish male prisoners, with the only task to dispose of the corpses from the crematory or gas chambers. After a defined period of time, all the members of the group were to be executed. Primo Levi concludes this to be one of the worst moments of the Jewish destiny. On reste stupéfait devant ce paroxysme de perfidie et de haine. C'est aux Juifs de mettre les Juifs dans le four. Il fallait démontrer que les Juifs, se pliaient à toutes les humiliations, allaient jusqu'à se détruire eux-mêmes. The task of Sonderkommando seals the Shoah as event without a witness or eliminating own witnesses. Bearing in mind that by becoming the member of Sonderkommando, the person is already deprived of the chance to survive, the drama introduces 2-level narration and multiple narrators. The first narrator is trustworthy witness survivor, who cannot be true witness according to Levi, telling the story as the combination of his own experience and the confession he heard. This is the confession of the member of Sonderkommando, who is dead, but thus he is being true witness. The prologue of the drama involves the first appearance of the narrator, for whom we know for sure, due to his camp number A12759, that is Leibovich personally, confirming the autobiographical and so-called autofictional moment. And the actual encounter with the member of Sonderkommando, number 33142, the member of the last group, whose life, his story, is presented as the main body of the drama. In fact, this one is embedded narrator, the one whom we see in the process of the storytelling. However, I'm speaking about the drama until this moment. In the film, the next scene of the drama, the only one in the exterior, outside the stuffy attic room, becomes the beginning in medias res. This introduction is cut out. The position of the narrator in film is solved in different way, through the symmetrical beginning and the end added in the scenario, adapted again by Leibović and Obrenović. The narrative charts the circle viciosus that positions the witness survivor and true witness narrator on both sides of life and death. At the beginning, in the central space of the camp, inside the barbed wire, under the spooky and dim lights of the reflectors, goes on the macabre ritual of the call for the volunteers for the special squad. In the last scene, we again see the volunteering of the new executioners, group of the now the old executioners have become the victims again because they are sentenced to death, and the next group of former victims is converted to a new identity of the members of Sonderkommand, this time time-limited. The camera slowly pans away, revealing at the edge of the frame the object of remembrance. Toy trumpet, the silent sound of the apocalypse, and the announcement of the deaths of the previous group. From the off, we hear the words spoken by Zeleny, played by Ljubo Tadić, the informal leader of the group, the one who tries to escape. He pronounces the following words: take the handful of ashes, or of anything gone away, and you would see that it's still fire, or that it might be. These are the words, these are the verses of Branko Milković from his famous poem, Eulogy to the Fire. And in the drama, they feature as the motto of the drama. They work as Jeanette's paratext. In the film, uttered by the well-known voice, they suggest that the whole story, in fact, is told in retrospective by homodiegetic narrator who speaks from the heights of the death and heaven. This displacement allows Levi's witness survivor, who cannot be the true one, as true one is drowned, submerged, dead, or mute, and thus unable to bear witness, to become true witness, complete one. He is dead and resurrected true witness and frame narrator, the one whom we don't see in the very act of storytelling, and thus he has an extra credibility and authority. I would just like to make a short comparison, because in another of the rare ex-Yugoslav films dealing with the topic of the Holocaust, 5 Minutes of Paradise, it's more indirect than Himmelkommando, we have the different solution for the narrator. This narrator appears as the embedded narrator against the dark scenery. Obviously, he's speaking from the other world, and he says something like this: you're going to hear my story. I have lived a very short life, but a very exciting one. The position of the narrator in Himmelkommando we discover at the very end. So we comprehend that is retroactively and with due delay, comprehend that this is the flashback confessional story. So I would say, this new narrator bridges the gap of bearing witness to a missing testimony. The newly shaped figure unites witness survivor from the drama and the dead witness of the reality, true one. Leibović and his experience, authentic and prosthetic memory, facts and fiction. The chosen point of view, or the chosen position of storytelling, absolves Himmelkommando from the sins committed by Pontecorvo in his famous film Capo, as described by Rivet in his even more famous De l'Abjection. Rivet brings up many important questions, among which the realism and the Holocaust, and the tracking shot as moral transgression. First, Rivet discards the realism. Le réalisme absolu, ce qui peut en tenir lieu au cinéma, est ici impossible. Toute tentative dans cette direction est nécessairement inachevée, donc immorale. Tout essai de reconstitution, de maquillage dérisoire et grotesque, toute approche traditionnelle du spectacle relève du voyeurisme et de la pornographie. Second, in the tracking shot forward movement of Pontecorvo's camera in order of reframing the dead body of Manello Riva on the barbed wire, he finds condemnable and forbidden spectacularization and aestheticization. The consequences are presentation of reality as physically tolerable for the viewer, making the viewer conclude, maybe unconsciously, that the Holocaust is problematic, but not unacceptable and forbidden. The visually tamed physical horror covers and hides the ethical issues, permitting assimilation of Holocaust into the mental scape of modern man, as Dene says. So, Himmelkommando escapes the dangers of immorality and spectacularization as the position of the witness narrator, at the same time being perpetuator and the victim, involves documentary interpolation of the objective true experience, thus justifying the comparison with Nuit Brouillard and its documentary tracking shots, highly praised both by Rivette and Denis. Authentic witness allowed to testify from the metaphysical heights possible only in cinema, expresses the disbelief, bewilderness, and horrors, shielding the shocked spectator. The second point, the style of the film. The style of the film is described as the hybridization of symbolism, realism, and expressionism, as pointed out in the leaflet inviting the audience for the projection in New York in MoMA. So this is 1961. 62 perhaps leaflet, when they described the film, they translated as a Sky Battalion. The Sky Battalion is a macabre study of the demoralizing effects of mass murderers of a group of men in an expressionistic liquidation camp. Photography with the raw immediacy of newsreels, horror of guilt with no escape. They emphasize this stylistic melange as the very virtue of the film, and unlike in Moscow, where the film was received with much criticism, socially and ideologically grounded, in New York it really got the standing ovations almost. The mise-en-scène in the shape of labyrinth and the reduced claustrophobic space, hellish atmosphere, both the river as Styx and Limbo afterwards, the absence of the Germans, they are just seen as distant shadows. They are shadows of the shadows, and they strengthen the scopophilic regime of the isolated, rigidly structured world, are conscious symbolic solutions for Georgi Leibovich. Only in this scenario, his habitual image action we all love and adore from his cult films such as Walter Brani's Sarajevo or Partizanska eskadrila is transformed into the Deleuzian affect image, one dealing with the profound internal world of the characters. Together with the expressionism, shadows and treatment of the space, acting in frozen facial expressions, grotesque body movements, the obtrusive realism verges documentarism. Through the inverted logic of the theories of André Bazin, realism emerges from the theatrical yet realistic scenery of an exclusive chronotope. All this further supports the interplay of visible and invisible, changing the ineffably, unnameable, inexpressible, unspeakable, unimaginable of the Holocaust. The representational patterns coalesce into the hyperrealism of the trauma, complement to the incomprehensible surreality found in the realm of camps. The hyperrealism of the images, emotions, perceptions, senses turns into the only possible realism of the trauma. The film also represents departure from the conventional narration, underlying modernism that repeats the traumatic experience of witnessing. Representation of the death as the center of the traumatic experience, and, as theoreticians warn us, one of the themes that should be approached with the pangs of fear and tremor, is handled accordingly. The indirect representation, as well as permanent haunting presence of death, are materialized in the marks on the bed, because they carve every day on the benches and on the beds in the room. The shadow of the commander you saw on the previous slide as the heat or the sounds emanating from the pipes in the room of the Sonderkommando, or as the smoke constantly pouring out from the chimneys. The border between life and death is barbed wire, and when camera languidly passes through it, the realms of the dark and the light exchange values of positive and negative. Light is negative, it is death without salvation. And the same thing is already present in another Holocaust Yugoslav film, The Ninth Circle, because every time our characters see the light, whether it's the moonlight or light of the reflectors, or when she gets out from the air raid shelter into the bright light of the day, bright sunlight, that gradually marks her approaching the death. She is either vitally endangered, and in the end she is taken to the concentration camp, always under the sign of the bright light. So the absence of the light and electricity I take as a sign at the beginning of the speech. So the epicenter of death, the inside of the gas chamber, is never shown. The death is seen as the reflection of light on the faces of the heroes throwing in the Cyclone B, because, among other things, they had to do that. The reactive shot of enlightened faces replaces the forbidden scene of death, to which they are all sinful passive eyewitnesses. Death is recorded as or through the imprint of light in the same way as in classical photography or film. Eventually, it is the light of death seen by prominent and Zeleny at the horizon. Unlike in the drama or in all theater staging, in film, when the sirens announcing the assassination of the commander of the camp are heard, the two are in the truck on the way to Tottenwald. Due to sabotage, the truck swerves off the road and they escape into the forests and swamps. They walk, ran, crawl through the water. They found the things left by those executed there. In the end, they climb up the hill only to see the enlightened horizon. The heavenly glow is a mixture of the fires burning in the field, bonfires of human bodies, or the furnaces of crematorium, and of the permanent dawn of death that awaits them. The landscape of light is not safe heaven, but the death of hell they think they have left behind. Zeleny turns away and walks back into the swamps, while prominent stays on the top with a frozen facial expression, very much like Munch's cream, while the light and glow are seen as reflected in his eyes. There is no way out from the vicious circles, there is no escape from ourselves, and death that is always structuring absence, and of course there is no escape from the memories and the ill conscience visible under the various lights. The film Himmelkommando escapes the traps of forbidden fiction through well-timed immersion into defection and modernist narration. The paradox of the precise chronotope and the universal perennial narrative make the film more than I have to stop to make sense of these. In fact, it makes the film more than just a document about the past, but also the warning about what might come in the future. It strengthens the fear in front of our present time worth of contempt, as not all the camps have barbed wire fence, and the furnaces in the crematorium are not the only bonfires in history. As one of the first films about the topic, it has the privilege to offer to those innocent through ignorance the scenes of the primal trauma. I again here refer to Serge Denis and the concept of innocence as required for witnessing, because he said something like this: what I understand today is that the beauty of Stevens's movie is due less to justness of the distance than to the innocence of the gaze. Innocence is a terrible grace granted to those first arrived, to those first one who simply sees or records. The audience follows bitter revelation, loss of innocence of our characters, as the members of Sonderkommando find themselves for the first time in the most impossible situations. The concept makes the film a word confrontation, coming eye to eye with the Shoah, trauma and testimony through lamination of facts, memories and fiction from three temporal perspectives. The first perspective is the time of the real lived through experience of the personal optique of Leibovitch. The second is the time of the writing of the text, 1955-56, as part of the, I would say, broader return or look back to the Holocaust. Third is a theoretical optique of our times. Taken together, they correspond to multiple positions of witnesses and interlocutors, enunciators in the destiny interwoven out of fiction and cinema verite, within the space of concentration camp that is exceptional but hardly unique anymore, as the whole theme now functions as a metaphor and not as a metonymy anymore. And here I would just like to remind you about that exceptional place, that space that is yet but no more the same one. The camp is a piece of land placed outside the normal juridical order, but it is nevertheless not simply an external space. What is excluded in the camp is, according to the etymological sense of the term exception, excapere, taken outside, included for its own exclusion. But what is first of all taken into juridical order is the state of exception itself. The camp is thus the structure in which the state of exception, the possibility of deciding on which found sovereign power, is realized normally. So, death camps are the narrational realm of the exceptional state and sovereign power of the encompassing memory and remembrance that are permitted ones as transmitting the lived-through experience of the dead and resurrected from the world of darkness, light that is possible only in fiction. The inevitably involved degree of misrepresentation becomes part of the strategy for the proper ethical confrontation with darkness of the event. And now I come back at the very end to that motive of inverted light and darkness values, and I come back again to my very personal memory. My grandfather was in the prisoner of war camp in Ravensbrück, and Otto Bichany-Merin, who is prominent art historian, writer, survivor from prisoners of war camps, and of course very prominent member of Jewish community in Belgrade. He wrote his memoirs about that time in the camp, and the book is completely forgotten now. So this is another rescue from oblivion of the book Doviđenjem Oktobru. He describes that motive of darkness that's been recurring through the stories of the Holocaust in diverse ways. And I just paraphrase him. They have put out the light. Half of Europe is veiled in darkness. They brought the dark onto the hearts and souls. The dark of the cemeteries, dark of the paralyzing horror, the dark of the barracks and barbed wire. Thanks a lot. And now I would like to present our next speaker, Paul Bernard-Nouraud, who is almost there, a PhD in art history and aesthetics at the School of High Studies in Social Sciences, with a dissertation on undefined bodies, the representation of the bodies and arts in Auschwitz. His impressive list of publications include Cartographier la Shoah, les témoignages de dessin, as well as Tentazioni de grammatique de vide de Barnett Newman of Field de Michel Rovner, Transmission des mémoires, etc. Of course, many participation at the conferences, and for his Raoul Hilberg Fellowship, Monsieur Bernard-Nouraud is researching theme of which we will just hear the part within his presentation, representation of bodies in visual contemporary arts after Auschwitz. That's it well?
Est-ce qu'on peut juste échanger?
Bien sûr. On va changer des places.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy and honored to be here today at Belgrade, and I would like to thank you for giving me the opportunity to share with you some key points of my research about contemporary art after Auschwitz, mainly visual arts and mainly paintings among the visual arts. First, a brief introduction, and I will be as brief as possible and as clear as possible, since my main concern is to propose a first approach to the visual arts and to art history in the aftermath of Auschwitz. Therefore, my first statements consider the terms themselves, and I will try to show how the terms lead to the concepts, both aesthetical and historical. As you can see, I use Auschwitz instead of the Greek term Holocaust, the Hebrew Shoah, or the Yiddish Khurban. This is, of course, a way to root my dissertation on the concrete ground, referring to the best known among the Nazi concentration and death camps, Auschwitz-Birkenau. But of course, if I'm referring to the camp itself, I will say Auschwitz-Birkenau instead of Auschwitz. I am of course aware that Auschwitz, on the one hand, does not tell us about the genocidal mass killings of Jewish people in Eastern Europe by shooting squads, the so-called Holocaust by bullets, and that on the other hand, it maintains in a way quite a Western European way of considering the genocide. I do believe nonetheless that the fact that a single world cannot cover up the genocide and the Nazi crimes is an evidence of its enormity. But Auschwitz, since it became a generic term, also refers in that perspective to the memory of the event and not only to the event itself. Or to nuance it again in a more appropriate way, Auschwitz tried to gather the multiple memories of the event. On the reverse, it has to do with how the memories simultaneously and successively distorted the event and reframed it from its occurrence until nowadays. To approach these multidirectional memories, as Michael Rothberg named the phenomenon, I will consider in a first time some of the processes of mediatization through a few examples, and in a second time consider the formal aspects we can deduce from this example. But previously, and in order to provide a general frame to my demonstration, I would like to emphasize one more time on the key word of the topic, after. I purposely detach in the title of my paper the word after images, which would refer in English to reminiscences in after and images. And indeed, most of the images I am studying are reminiscences. But by naming them, we do not explain the process of reminiscence itself. and especially the processes the concept implements in the case of Auschwitz. In order to explain it, and not simply to express it, we can call to another field of interest, art history. As you might know, in the artistic field, when an artwork is said to have been made after something, it can mean that the author makes explicit that he copied someone else's work, or even more interesting, when it is said that a particular landscape, for example, was made after nature, it implies first that the artist was there, saw the actual landscape he painted, and second, that the image he produced comes after the model. It was not done from scratch ex nihilo, but after a true model. The first consequence designates the drawer as a witness, and an eyewitness furthermore, if the eyewitness is the person able to say, I was here. The word after indicates such a deictic. The second consequence designates the image as an evidence of the reality of a piece of nature, evidence confirming and legitimizing the status of its author as an eyewitness. For both, the word after structures the reception of the artwork, establishing with the viewer a relationship based on reliance, a relationship of the same kind of the one relating the author of a memoir and his reader. One could, of course, object that in such case I'm forgetting the artist's subjectivity and its implication into the act of creation under the experienced truth. But if art history cannot ignore it, it is to history to evaluate it regarding historical truth as the only criteria. Otherwise, the discussion would be endless, as is endless the discussion about the proportion of fiction in a historical novel. What seems more important is to pay attention to the basic fact that the landscape in painting is no more the nature. The definitive rupture between experience and representation of the experience defines a chronological absolute. A testimony, and more widely memory, always distorts and reframes the experience at the same time it tries to stick to it. Consequently, after includes both a tradition, a respect towards what has been seen or what is being remembered, a tradition on the one hand, and a treason on the other hand. In search to find a way to express the experience of the memory, the act of speech, writing, or drawing, the act of expression is a critical one. It makes selections of the experience itself. We thus can define the artistic memory of Auschwitz not only as a tradition or a treason, but as a translation. How this translation occurs, how it is constituted, to be diffused thereafter, and how we can approach this translation are among the many questions I will try to raise and to specify in the next minutes. I call the broken lines, as you can see, the broken lines of modernity. Not only the ones which are situated after Auschwitz, but even prior to Auschwitz. One of the most common platitudes about art and Auschwitz asserts that the event did not modify in any way the artistic trend of modernity, while politics, philosophy, internal relations, and so on were deeply disturbed by it. A closer look to the history of modern art demands a more subtle approach. Consequently, I would argue that Auschwitz first rushed the artistic trends of modernity, rushing the tendency being the definition of an event according to art historian Henri Fosillon. And in a second time, Auschwitz provoked a rupture whose most visible effect can be seen on the figuration of human bodies. I am consequently speaking here of a backlash effect of Auschwitz on the visual art. To apprehend both these accelerating and backlashing effects, we should now turn to some of the artworks themselves on which I decided to focus my analysis. To go deep into it would be beyond the scope of my lecture today, so I decided to delimitate in a very, very schematic way the field of modern art. Thereby, I will consider three main trends of artistic expression: representation, abstraction, and figuration. I'm going to define it. And to make it even clearer, I would take three examples from art before Auschwitz, and more specifically, works made in the context of World War I. Representation can be defined as an art rooted into the academic tradition, obeying to literal interpretation of mimesis. It can also be called realism, despite the fact it is actually highly conventional. This is, for instance, a typical reconstruction of an episode of a battle scene. As you can see, people are supplying new guns into the mud, riding horses, both animals and human beings sharing the same fate, while an airplane in the sky, yes, it's not obvious, but there is an airplane in the sky, appears as a symbol of hope, and a shell explosion as a symbol of violence. Modernity and tradition are coexisting into the topic as they are into the way the scene is represented, not to say it is narrated. The actual fighting is elsewhere, and none of the 500,000 corpses of the Battle of Passchendaele in the Belgian Flanders can be seen on this picture. They are literally abstracted from the composition. This is, of course, a totally different kind of abstraction I'm speaking about, with the famous black square on white background by Kazimir Malevich, the Russian painter. He painted in 1914, 1915. It might have nothing to do with the war context, and is generally considered as a typical example of art for the art's sake. But it can also be interpreted as a more authentic vision of the dead, since they cannot be represented, 500,000 people cannot be represented, since the experience appears incommensurable to art. Therefore, it aims a more universal scale by obstructing any narrative tendency, as we've seen before. Figuration now is not only an in-between abstraction and representation. Contrary to representation, it avoids the reenactment of the experience by focusing on its effects, making figuration close to memory. Like abstraction, it reaches a non-narrative level but maintains an explicit link to a specific experience. It has to do with testimony, but a testimony which could not be used in a justice court since it lacks the date and place which back the witness I was here. To represent the event, to abstract from it, or to figure it are the three ways, again in a very schematic approach, modern art dealt with the experience prior to Auschwitz. Such an approach could not be complete without considering the strong influence of photography on them. Photographs considered as documents therefore appear as mediation between experience and artistic creation, even when, in Dick's case, the artist himself was a soldier and a veteran. But Otto Dix did use and sustained Ernst Friedrich Pacifist's book's image, War to War, for subsequent artworks, for instance. We can also imagine that some of the aerial views of the battlefields before and after the battle occurred did influence or confirm what we can call the abstract level of expression. Like pictures of battles episodes sustained and inspired military painters as Harold Power, we've seen, when they were commissioned to represent World War I by official officers. Commissioned or not, artists and veterans also drew their experience, like during Auschwitz, deportees and survivors drew it. I won't go deeper into the testimonial role of the drawings, but we will see later that in some cases they fulfilled a matrix role for artistic expression. In the meantime, I would like to stay with the mediation role of the photographs. This is also a crucial aspect in the case of Auschwitz. Some artists, like the Berliner drawer Jorge Gross, who emigrated in the US in 1933, produced images of the concentration camps thanks to testimonies they heard from friends who survived and emigrated during the Nazi era. They fit as anti-Nazi propaganda. But for most of the artists, their visual knowledge depended mainly on the photographs they saw after the opening of the death camps in 1944 and first half of 1945. Before these dates, almost nobody out of the concentration universe had anything else but an imaginary vision of the camps. We do know the shock the publication of the Nazi atrocity provoked on the public opinion and how it convinced the people of the reality of the genocide and the repression. but very few has been investigated about the impact of these photos on the visual artists. To consider how they reacted from a biographical perspective is not very relevant here, and in any case it's not sufficient. What matters are their artistic responses, their replies to it, and it is not surprising that at first glance we find the same answer as during and after World War I. That means representation. It is of course particularly true about the representational regime you can see here. An early example can be found in Ben Shan's Boy of 1944. Shan was a photographer himself, skilled during the Great Depression in the US, and during the war he became a member of the US propaganda unit. So he received lots of pictures he reused then in paintings basically. What is more surprising is the use an American veteran like Corrado Cali did of likely picture. Cali was among the US soldiers who opened Buchenwald on April 11, 1945. The same day the Nordozen concentration camp near Dora was opened by other US troops. In his drawing, Cagli reused a corpse present on a Nordozen photograph to depict a vision of Buchenwald camp. The phenomenon is not unusual, and we know several veterans who repainted their sketches, or survivors, who repainted the sketches they made after the experience, basing them on photograph, as if the photograph was a more reliable source than the inner experience. It is not even something which happened only in the direct aftermath of World War II. For example, in 1969, Jack Levin engraved a lithograph after the two pictures of the so-called Stroop report, a Nazi document about the liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto in May 1943. Levin said that these photos haunted him for years before he decided to interpret them in a non-photographic way. What is interesting is that under the effect of time and memory, he blurred the clear lines of the original photographs. We can recognize here more a device used by a better-known artist like Gerhard Richter. Richter uses family pictures he transforms in blurry paintings so he respects the original black and white. Here is Nazi uncle named Rudi, a German officer. Here, still in 1965, his aunt Marianne, killed by the Nazis because she was mentally deficient. In both cases, we stay into the representational regime we defined, but what is interesting is that when Richter decided to, in the second half of the 60s, to work after photographs from the camps, he moved to a totally abstract regime for several years. As if Richter was unable to cope with the atrocities picture and to blur them as he did for his family ones. Nevertheless, even if it's not visible under reproduction, the second great painting, the one titled Fingerprints, actually you have fingerprints on the abstract painting. The same we can detect, for instance, at the same period in Jackson Pollock drawings. They are abstract, but if you look to the detail, you can see handprints on the same canvas. I won't speak about American abstractionism, but it is well known that this movement appeared in the aftermath of World War II in the US. And it might not be by chance that its main American advocates, the art critic Clement Greenberg, Harold Rosenberg, the painter Mark Rothko, and Barnett Newman, were from Jewish roots, and they together considered that the aftermath of the war period was an opportunity to start from scratch, as if the painting never existed, stated Barnett Newman. From the late 40s to the early 70s, the international art scene was surrounded by the debate between abstraction and the so-called figuration, I called it, representation. The controversy mainly affected painting, but actually touched sculpture and installations as well. What seems manifest in both cases is that the notion of absence was now at the artwork core. And nothing, even an outfit, hung in a museum or an art gallery could be seen anymore without some other pictures in mind, whether they came directly or not, consensually or not, from concentrationary memories. What is particularly significant is how the notion of absence affected not only the artwork's topic, but their means of expression, their shapes. The way absence of the innumerable dead, shaped the contemporary artistic expression is highly visible in a deeply renewed regime of figuration. In order to show these processes of figuration, I would like now to follow some of the features of the artistic trajectory of the painter and survivor from Dachau, Zoran Mušić, born in what is now a Slovenian town, Gorica. Mušić was deported from Venice, where he was living by the end of 1944, so he was able, especially in April 1945, to draw some sketches of what he witnessed. This is one of the 200, among 200 drawings he made. Most of them were lost. According to him, Mušić kept the remnant drawings in his studio after the war, but he did not represent the topic for 25 years after his liberation. He dedicated his art to paint landscapes, city views, and horse riders. He even went into abstraction for a short period, but he never painted again during 25 years what he saw and drew in Dachau. In spite of this gap in his work, in 1969, 1970, Mušić started a new series of drawings, paintings, and engravings called We Are Not the Last. At first glance, there are very few differences with the non-sketches from Dachau. But one detail must draw our attention. On the breast of the previous hanged people, Mušić wrote what looks like a prisoner number. I don't know if you can see it on the reproduction. There is the number. This number disappeared in the etching after Dachau. In our perspective, this single detail initiates a shift from the representational regime to the figurative one. This is of first importance because by following such details and changes in Mušić's oeuvre, we can approach the diffusion of Auschwitz into contemporary art and figuration. I will give you only one example from Mušić's work, so we will try then to expand our conclusions from it. It is not directly about shapes, but about the topical detail. In several drawings from Dachau 1945, Mušić represented corpses with the hands pulled back on the neck. It might be last physiological reflex, ante-mortem. It may also be the result of the way people were gathering the corpses, but it was not imagination by Mušić. It was neither memory. It was what he actually had in front of him in Dachau. Some photos taken by US troops in Dachau at the same period confirm that the crossed position of arms and hands was widespread among the corpses. We know several examples of the position in the series We Are Not the Last from the 1970s. In etchings here, lithographs, or oils on canvas. It is then consequent enough to consider the detail as a reference to what he eyewitnessed, a mark of respect toward his experience and the multiple dead. But what is more surprising is the way the enormity of the hands he figured spread in other of his paintings with totally different topics. See, for instance, this portrait of Ida Barbarigo, his wife, herself a painter, and the disproportion between the hand and the head. Consider this late self-portrait from the 1990s. Mušić died in 2005 but stopped painting in the late 1990s. Or the very last one, whether he depicted himself as a viandante, a vagrant in Italian, or just seated in an armchair in a melancholic gesture. Of course, my purpose is not mainly to identify likely gestures in art prior, during, or after Auschwitz. But it seems to me relevant, a relevant path to approach the corpuses and consider the backlash effect on them. And I do look at Mušić as a highly significant exemplum of the evolution of art history during the last 70 years. Let me please now, to conclude, expose some of the stylistic features of art after Auschwitz, or in other words, its extension, its cast shadow on contemporaneity. In an article dedicated to post-war French artist Bernard-Nouraud, who killed himself in 1961, entitled Bernard-Nouraud and His Body, Roland Barthes gave in 1973 a provocative definition of modernity. Barthes wrote, "To be modern is to know what is not possible anymore." Among the many impossibilities due to modernity, Barthes mainly points the finished, arguing that in the former representational regime, since imitation was the purpose to finish a painting, to achieve it, was conceivable. When the imitation is accurate and perfect, the artist can consider the job done. But in modern painting, I would say in abstraction and figuration, whose main purpose is not imitation anymore, the idea of finishing an artwork cannot be still valid and aesthetically valued. In his apprehension of Réquichaud's paintings, in the fact that Réquichaud was troubled by his incapacity to finish a painting, but does not ignore what he calls a game of historical determinations. I would argue that in such a game, Auschwitz plays a central role. Of course, Leonardo da Vinci already spoke about the componento inculto, the informal sketch, and of the non finito, the unfinished. And Leonardo gave them artistic values. There is no, but what is very important is that in art after Auschwitz, the non-finito is not an option anymore. It is art's fate. The idea that literal imitation has been in a way defeated not only comes from the competition photography impulse with painting, it comes from the fact that what the photos from the Nazi camps show cannot be remade in painting without distorting them. These pictures are too finished for sensibility. It is not only photography who rushed the modernity trends in visual arts, it is also what the photos themselves were carrying. If the unfinished can be considered as a central axis of visual arts after Auschwitz, we can derive from it at least three stylistic features. First, as you can see, the advent of what we could call a sketchy style, even in paintings, characterized by blurred lines and mixed color. Second, and consubstantially, a reduction of what is figured on the support, the human figure, which was considered as the main topic, is reduced to the bare minimum in terms of proportion, which is also a way to expose the unfinished, and the figure is relegated to the background. Third, and consequently, the background becomes the foreground, or in better words, the limit between figure and background is confused. These three features participate in a kind of irresolution on behalf of the artist and from an uncertainty of artistic gesture. Not being able to finish a face, to achieve a body, to fill a sculpture, to vanish a painting or to cover it with plain colors, or even to join lines in a drawing may sound very familiar to most of contemporary artists, as familiar as it sounds to its spectators. Let me insist on this to make an idea of how Auschwitz first transformed the visual arts and then diffused this transformation into our common visual background. Just remember how the dead hands passed from concentrationary visions of Zoran Muzic and representation to concentrationary memories, and then to contemporary figurations. By following these complex ways, a naive viewer could hardly tell where the ghostly aspect of Music's self-portrait comes from. Yet nowadays, this ghostly aspect became a widespread manner to represent any kind of human bodies, not only the suffering ones. One would object that these processes are diluting Auschwitz as an experience and an event. If diluting here means that artworks are not fulfilling a witnessing role but maintaining tenuous and complex memories of it, I would agree. Dilution is also a form of diffusion, and artistic creation does not invalidate testimonies. On the contrary, the latter frame the former. To say it in Imre Kertész's often cited words, they are both participating and not competing, participating in making the Holocaust our culture. I thank you very much for your attention. And
Now, very shortly, since we are running a bit late, what I would suggest is to profit from the break for the informal exchange of questions and hopefully adequate answers, and not to engage in the Q&A very formal session. If the organizers would agree with that, is it all right? Then may I invite you to some refreshments in the short break. After that, we continue with the plenary session. Thanks a lot.